Amina stood at the hospital cashier, with rain still slicking the red earth outside. Her fingers trembled on the thin wallet that had housed 3 months of overtime, and she felt the hospital matron's eyes like a verdict on her brow. If she did not pay that bill, the old man on the stretcher would be turned away to die, and Amina knew what dying in the backstreets meant: no ambulance, only a danfo horn and a long night. Why would a nurse pay a patient's bill with her own savings, and who would protect her when the hospital's ledger and pride were stacked against the poor? She heard the generator hum, smelled the clinic's disinfectant, and for a moment, imagined a hidden fortune, something large and unthinkable, standing somewhere behind the tiled reception, a shadow that could either crush or save them all. She pushed her card through the reader, felt the thinness of the balance, and wondered who would notice her choice, and why it would matter later. Then, a man at the bedside cleared his throat and looked up in a way that made everything sharper. I and the cramped 3-room flat behind the mosque courtyard, Amina's ordinary world was a map of small, steady sacrifices, as she rose with the Hamadan breath, threaded through market bustle to her night shift at Mazi General Hospital, sent money to her younger brother in the sucker, and kept her mother's cooking pot full on Sundays because dignity, to her, was not charity but responsibility. She had been the nurse in the clinic for 6 years, known for the way she moved, a soft touch with the fevered and a ready laugh with the children, and everyone in the nearby danfo stop knew her name, though no one knew the size of the debt she carried. The title of what people would whisper later, "Nurse paid a patient's bill, his son turned out to be a billionaire," was an absurd headline in the days when she could not imagine a billionaire's hand touching her life, and the thought of such a gulf made her chest ache as if someone were pressing the red earth upon it. Still, she believed in doing the right thing even when the world did not notice, and the man's eyes at the bedside did notice something Amina could not yet name. The inciting moment came like a shard of glass, ere the matron, Mrs. Kalu, returned from the accounts room with a ledger that smelled of old paper and oil, and she accused Amina in front of patients of irregular transactions, a phrase that, in that hospital, meant the kind of public shaming that could end a career. "You can't take the hospital's money into your hands," the matron snapped, voice carrying into the church courtyard next door and into the market where traders paused to listen, and Amina felt every eye as an accusing pulse. She had indeed paid the man's bill from her own pocket, but she had not taken hospital funds. When a security guard came and placed a hand on her shoulder, the room tightened, and even the generator seemed to hush. She tried to explain, but one of the doctors who admired her work looked away, and the patient's family murmured in confusion. The man at the bedside sat very still, and Amina wondered who he was, and why he had not spoken. The question caught like a thorn and would not let go. At first trial she faced was bureaucratic, an investigation notice, a suspension letter, and the sudden absence of nighttime pay that had been her thin cushion against the landlord. Her landlord, a man who wore a gold toothpick of a ring and kept the television on too loud, walked to her door with the notice to vacate, and Amina felt the house shrink around the small metal bed where she stored the meager evidence of her life, her nursing certificate, a photograph of her mother, and the old alarm clock that ticked like a judge. She took extra shifts at a private clinic where the generator hummed louder and the patients paid in cash that never reached her bank, and each night she returned to the flat smelling of kerosene and coffee, lighter by a handful of naira. Someone circulated a video of the matron's accusation on a phone in the market, and it spread like a festival rumor. Amina's name was spoken in sharp, surprised tones, and she saw for the first time how quickly a single act could be reframed as a crime. She slept on her own conscience, but woke to a phone full of numbers she did not recognize, and the man at the bedside was no longer there, leaving a folded piece of paper on the bedside table that she did not open. The second trial pulled another thread loose, and Mercy, a colleague who had smiled at Amina's wedding and shared lunch, began to behave like a friend, but reported Amina's payment as unauthorized to the matron, hoping to curry favor for a promotion. "I only thought of the rules," Mercy said in the corridor one afternoon, voice as soft as a prayer but eyes calculating, and Amina felt a winter in her bones when she realized friendship could be traded for advancement. Mercy's betrayal was the kind that cut deeper because it was precise and opportunistic. She brought up petty details in meetings that made Amina look careless, and she began to answer Pa Tian's complaints with a clipped authority that suggested she was chosen by the hospital to replace Amina if the board saw fit. Meanwhile, a man in a plain shirt, neither the clean suit of a wealthy visitor nor the worn jacket of a local driver, was seen sitting in the hospital garden reading the Quran, watching the hospital politics with a stillness that unsettled Amina, and the folded piece of paper remained unanswered on the bedside table. Who had left it, and why? A week later, the pattern shifted, as the video of the matron accusing Amina reached the local radio. Callers shouted, some in anger, some in support, and Amina's brother's employer, fearing scandal, let him go, which meant the dinner pot would be empty if she did not act. Debts multiplied, medical bills for an aunt's dialysis, school fees for her niece, the landlord's impatience, and Amina felt each addition like another stone on her chest. She pleaded with the hospital board, showed them the cashier receipt, and watched as Mrs. Kalu flicked the paper like a fly. The board postponed judgment and set a hearing in 3 days, a phrase that sounded like a noose if you had ever been counted out. On the third night, the clinic lights buzzed late, and a whisper spread that the patient she had helped had been abandoned by kin and taken to the public mortuary, and Amina's hands went cold. She could not tell whether the man at the bedside had left because of fear, duty, or something else that would later astonish them all. Time moved like a drumbeat skipping a crucial beat, 2 weeks of suspended wages, and the landlord's letter turned to a firm knock at the door and a list of demands. Amina was given 3 days to find another place or pay double. She picked up extra shifts at a private nursing agency under the blistering sun, felt the red earth under her sandals after rain, and sometimes paused by the mosque courtyard where neighbors blessed her in passing while their whispers rode the Hamatan. Reports reached her that the matron was planting seeds of rumor in the church courtyard, suggesting Amina had taken advantage of the paternal patient, a phrase that filled Amina with shame even though she had done nothing wrong, and the hospital put her license under review, a bureaucratic weight that could take years to lift. Then, one evening, as she sorted linen at the hospital's back door, a courier handed her a small envelope with no return. Inside was a note that read, "You did the right thing." Wait. There was no signature, and the silence after that sentence felt like the calm before a storm. The seed of kindness was simple and fierce, and months earlier, in the fever of a rainy night, Amina had walked the hospital corridor when the old man arrived, his clothes wet, his breath shallow, and she bought his medicine at the pharmacy with the tiny savings she had kept for her mother's cough, tucking the receipt into her pocket without telling anyone because she thought the right thing required neither applause nor permission. She had given him the last of her sugar sachets and warmed a cup of tea for his cold hands, and a young man had watched from the doorway, not saying a word but steady as a pillar. He had not stepped forward to stop her, nor to join it, only watched. The next day, she found a small carving of a fish on the bedside table and thought it was a token of thanks from the family. Why, she could not know then how that simple, unpaid kindness, a cup of tea, the paid bill, would be recorded and remembered by someone who carried an invisible weight of reputation and power. That quiet witnessing, now a memory, would later be named in a courtroom and on a stage she could not imagine. Pressure compressed like a fist, as the hospital board scheduled the hearing by dawn of the third day, the landlord pushed for keys at noon, and the nursing council threatened to suspend her license within 48 hours if the board filed a formal complaint. If you do not produce witnesses, we will have to assume the worst, the matron stated in the boardroom, while the air smelled faintly of roasted groundnuts through the open window and a danfo horn screamed somewhere far away as if to mark time. Amina's phone filled with messages, some kind, some angry, and her brother begged her not to bring shame to the family, voice breaking over the line as he paced in a small shop by the market. There was a binding deadline stamped in every letter and a clear consequence, and without a verdict in her favor, she would lose her home, her license, and the small trust that kept her family fed. The man who had watched at the bedside had not yet come forward, and the silence felt like a cliff's edge. When the midpoint twist came, it came not with a drum but with a calm disruption. At the board hearing, the plain-shirted man walked into the room and removed his cap, and the room inhaled when he said his name, Abina Adebayo, and then dropped the other name, as CEO of Adebayo Holdings, a conglomerate that paid for stadium lights and school wings in 3 countries. He had been the patient's son all along, he announced, voice steady and sure, and he had been in the hospital not as a visitor but as a test. I have been away doing my work, he told the board, and I came back to see what would happen to my father. I saw a nurse pay what others refused. The revelation was a reframe so vivid, Amina felt the floor tilt. She saw in the man's eyes not the gold of a rich man, but the tired clarity of someone who had watched systems fail and wanted to find the humane places within them. For the first time, the gulf between the world of danfo horns and kidnap drivers and the air-conditioned cars of the wealthy was bridged by a single human act, and Amina stood with her hands clenched, feeling both anger and a strange, new hope. Darkness followed like a tide retreating to show the stones. It espied Abina's declaration. The hospital's legal team dragged the matter into formal litigation and threatened to argue for negligence. The matron's allies in the board twisted the narrative and demanded that Amina prove her motives beyond a nurse's oath. In the tiny hours, alone on the hospital roof with the humid night weighing on her, Amina thought of accepting a hush payment, an anonymous sum that would clear debts and buy a new path away from the hospital, but the image of the old man's cold hands at the bedside steadied her. She chose dignity over an easy exit, telling Amina through a trembling voice that she wanted only to be cleared, to keep her license, and to protect others who could not pay. She refused to let her name be used as a bargaining chip. That refusal was not dramatic, it was the sum of many small, quiet decisions she had made since childhood, and it cost her a sleepless night and the prospect of losing everything as the lawyers sharpened their pens. The climax played out across sunlight and paper. Amina, with the slow authority of a man used to moving mountains, opened his company's internal audit and presented documents that showed the matron had been siphoning funds to a private account, invoices paid for services never rendered, and a pattern of irregular transactions that reached into the boardroom. "This is not just about one nurse," he said, voice carrying over the white tiles of the hearing room. "This is about a system that allows the poor to subsidize the rich's comfort by collecting fines for their lives." Security officers in plain clothes escorted Mrs. Kalu out of the hospital that afternoon. The matron's face as she left was not the stern mask she wore on duty, but a paper-thin thing exposed to sun. On the screen of the local radio, the man who had once muttered about Amina's supposed theft was called to account, documents were read aloud, and the sting of public vindication landed like rain on parched ground, sharp, refreshing, and irrevocable. In the following moments, the consequences for the antagonist were delivered in a practical, public way. The hospital was placed under a provisional administration, Mrs. Kalu's professional license was suspended pending full inquiry, and the board members who had turned away from complaints were asked to step down while an independent committee reviewed their conduct. Mercy, the colleague who had betrayed Amina for a promotion, stood in the corridor with her hands empty as she watched Amina return the hospital's welcome with a small, measured nod. She was not humiliated beyond reason. Amina would not let revenge become her language, but Mercy was demoted and assigned to community outreach to learn what it meant to serve. Outside, the danfo horns resumed their business, and the market bustle continued, but the atmosphere in the hospital had shifted. The generator's hum seemed less oppressive and more like background to a place trying to heal itself. Restoration came in tangible, grounding ways. Amina set up an emergency fund to clear Amina's debts and reopened the hospital's patient assistance program. He insisted not on buying gratitude, but on creating structural change, funding a wing for low-income patients and a scholarship program for nurses from poor neighborhoods to train and rise. Amina's license was reinstated within weeks, the eviction notice torn up over a steaming cup of tea in the courtyard where neighbors watched and cheered, and her brother's job was reinstated through a program the conglomerate began with local employers. The community watched as a new clinic building went up, paint bright against the red earth after rain, with a solar array that hums instead of the old diesel generator, and where before the matron's name had been a shadow in conversation, now nurses walked with a steadied assurance that their care mattered and would be protected. Amina kept the small carved fish the patient had left and placed it on the shelf above her bed as a reminder that one act of kindness can shift the axis of many lives. Amina's new normal was both humble and profound, as she still rose with the Hamadan breath, still threaded the market bustle, but now her stroll to work cut through the hospital courtyard that smelled of fresh paint and jasmine, and she sometimes saw Amina quietly walking the wards in plain clothes, listening, learning, and refusing applause. The scholarship named for the nurse who paid granted a young woman from her neighborhood a place in nursing school, and microloans funded by the hospital's new charitable arm helped small traders afford the rainy season without selling their cooking pots. Where once her family's name had been whispered with pity at the danfo stop, it was now spoken with the careful respect of people who had seen a wrong righted. Amina still kept her head low in everyday modesty, but she walked with a steadier spine because the things she valued, truth, dignity, service, had been restored in the world around her. Kindness matters, and truth matters. Small acts can shift vast fortunes, and the dignity of one person can pull a whole community toward justice. Never assume the shape of people's lives from the chapter you meet them in. A cup of tea, a paid bill, a refusal to take an easy lie, can become the bridge between where you are and what the world could be. If this story moved you, tell me in the comments what you would do in Amina's place, and share a moment when a small kindness changed your life. Please like, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you won't miss the next tale from our street corners and hospital courtyards. There are many more stories waiting to be told. The interval beat still thrummed in the air like a bead of rain slipping down a glass window. Amina's name had been spoken aloud, and the hospital's white tiles seemed to lean closer, listening, as the crowd waited for the voice that would turn a rumor into a map for the next road. The immediate stakes sharpened in Amina's chest: her license, her home, the bare thread that tied her to her mother and brother, and the possibility that power could choose mercy for once rather than punishment. And she found herself asking, in a voice she barely recognized, what does a woman do when the man who wields the power to erase your life is suddenly offering a path to repair and protection for others, not just himself? The answer, at least in that tremor before the dawn moment, was not a loud declaration but a decision to listen first, to watch how the room's hum would bend when truth walked from the door in the form of a quiet, deliberate plan. And the plan, as it began to form in her mind, carried two threads: one tangible and demanding, a legal and financial turning of the hospital toward accountability, and one human and stubborn, a vow to keep lifting people up even after the cameras and headlines dimmed. The act of listening became a kind of action in itself, and soon the mid-morning light on the boardroom's glass seemed to widen like a doorway. Amina laid out a ledger of hospital misappropriations, not as a weapon, but as an armature upon which a new floor could be built, and his voice carried the cadence of someone who had learned that wealth could be a tool for justice if wielded with restraint and a patient eye for the vulnerable. He spoke of a foundation he would seed through Adebayo Holdings, a real, living thing named after the nurse who paid a bill with her own coin and asked nothing in return, a program that would subsidize care for the poor, train nurses fro and the very neighborhoods where the Hamadan bites hardest, and install solar-powered wings to replace the diesel hum that had once dictated who could be saved and who could not. As the documents unfurled, Mercy's whispered attempts to tighten the screws around Amina's future with petty accusations collapsed against the bright line of evidence Amina presented, and even the security guards in plain clothes shifted their weight with the soft, audible sense of witnesses waking up to something they could not ignore any longer. The room's air shifted again when Amina, hearing her own name spoken in a context of truth rather than rumor, realized she could not simply endure, and she would have to help construct the new architecture that would shield others from the old one's greed. The midpoint turn came not as a dramatic scream, but as a quiet hinge in which power, once abstract and distant, pressed its weight into the details of a single life. In the hallway outside the hearing room, a nurse who had kept her head low during weeks of scrutiny found Amina and began to speak not in caution, but in earned confidence. We saw you without seeing you, Nurse Amina. We saw your hands in the tea and the bill, and we believed in your mercy even before we believed in your guilt. The nurse's words landed like a coin flipping in a palm, revealing that the hospital staff, once silenced by fear, began to gather around a shared sense of purpose. They had watched the old matron's ledger, heard rumors ripple through the danfo-packed roots, and now they saw a future where the court of public opinion served not as a trap, but as a guardian of conscience. Then Amina revealed the next layer: the whistleblower in his own company who had fed him the patterns of misallocation, a person who understood that wealth could be a shield or a sword, and chose to wield it to protect those who could not protect themselves. That whistleblower's identity could not be made public yet, the man explained, because he feared retaliation from the very systems that trembled at exposure, but the plan would move forward with transparency as its backbone and accountability as its spine. The room's tension eased as the thread of concealment dissolved under the glow of a plan that required all hands to be honest, and Amina found herself tasting the first cautious hope that did not taste like a dare. Closed loops arrived with a practical, visible payoff that made the future feel imminently real. The hospital's provisional administration agreed to suspend activities that had been skewed toward the comfortable, and a long-delayed audit would become the engine of honest reform. The matron, on. See a name whispered with fear in the market and the mosque courtyard, was escorted to a quiet place to reflect on the consequences of her choices, while Mercy's position shifted from favored ally to scholar of ethics, assigned to community outreach to learn what it means to serve without the safety net of fear or ambition. And most powerfully, the interval's twist, Amina's vow to seed a foundation, translated into tangible opportunities, a scholarship fund for nurses from drought-stricken neighborhoods, a loan program for small traders who had watched their pots boil dry in the rain, and the first wing of a green hospital built entirely with solar power, its walls catching the sun like a promise and its corridors echoing with the soft, hopeful hum of equipment that would not betray the poor again. Amina's license was restored, and her name, once tainted by rumor, now stood as a banner for a new social contract between hospital and neighborhood. Her family's debt began to shrink under the weight of collective generosity, and the community's faith in the hospital center, its heart, reawakened with a vitality that could not be silenced. But the narrative did not close its circle here. Instead, it stepped deeper into the ethics of a wealth gap that continued to press the edges of everyday life with sunlight and shadow. The wealth gap anchors appeared in sensory contrasts, as the hospital's freshly painted wings glowed under the midday sun while the danfo horn outside shouted its ordinary insistence, and the solar panels on the new wing reflected a sky that seemed to tilt toward a more inclusive future. Amina, walking the wards in plain clothes, spoke with new authority as a benevolent philanthropist who refused to let the city imagine that generosity could exist apart from accountability. Amina, with a nurse's calm and a woman's courage, stood by the patients' beds with a new ease, knowing that responsibility was not a private burden, but a collective project. The first beneficiaries of the foundation scholarship, a bright girl from a market stall family who carried her mother's apron in her backpack as if it were a flag, began nursing school that very term, and the prospect of more young voices rising gave the courtyard a quiet music that had not been heard there in years. The closing beat of this legible arc, while still inviting the next chapter, rested on a seed planted in a single, ordinary gesture. On the clinic's wall now hangs a simple inscription, a reminder of the fish carving left by a silent patient, and beside it another line, etched by a steward of change, reading, "The nurse who paid did not pay for peace alone, she paid for a promise that everyone must keep." As the street outside filled with the rustle of market talk and the steady stride of nurses moving through sunlit corridors, Amina imagined a storefront clinic, a night market that glowed with the care of a night shift that never truly ends, and she felt the steady, almost unnoticeable pull of a new life's rhythm, ere the old harms had been. Ian acknowledged, the new commitments were now real, and the world was finally listening not to the rumor of her debt, but to the enduring proof of her mercy and the long horizon of a justice that begins with a cup of tea, a paid bill, and a stubborn insistence that dignity is owed to every life, especially the ones who have the least voice to claim it. 2 weeks later, the hospital courtyard woke under a sun that felt tuned to a gentler mercy, and Amina moved with the same steady hands that once steadied a feverish child, only now those hands carried a soft certainty as the new wing, slim, clean, powered by sun, glowed at the edge of the compound like a lighthouse for a city that had learned to navigate its own shadows. Amina walked beside her in plain clothes, a quiet witness among students in white coats who wore hope like a badge, and a banner unfurled at the entrance proclaimed the Adebayo Foundation for Community Health, a statement that sounded almost miraculous to the stretchers and market voices that had once crossed this space as if it were a battlefield rather than a place to heal. The air carried the scent of fresh paint and jasmine, the generator hummed beneath the surface of the day's chatter, and a dozen small victories gathered in earnest like birds at a power line, from the grandmother who would now get dialysis without pleading to the boy who would not drop out of school because the fees finally stayed paid, while Amina's colleagues watched with the slow, swollen relief of people who have learned to doubt less and trust more. Mercy stood at the edge of a crowd watching the new nurses run through a drill, and when she caught Amina's eye, she gave a small nod that did not pretend there had never been a breach, only that the breach had become a doorway, a chance to mend the pattern rather than pretend the wound never happened. "We are learning to measure care by what it costs us to keep faith with the vulnerable," Mercy whispered to a junior nurse, and the nurse answered with a wary smile that grew into something more confident as the room filled with the soft clack of stethoscopes and the murmur of patients who were becoming names again rather than cases. In the midst of this quiet, a visitor appeared. No pomp, just a man in a clean shirt with a notebook and a calm demeanor, and he asked to speak with Amina, not with a demand, but with a request to record her account for a public edition that would travel beyond the danfo routes and into homes where the families waited for proof that justice could be practical and not merely performative. she spoke softly, outlining the moment she paid that bill, the way she had walked away from the stairs with her spine intact, and she saw in his eyes a careful, almost clinical gratitude that did not forget the price paid by many to keep truth unbroken. And as he thanked her, she realized that the city's appetite for accountability had grown teeth of its own, ready to bite into the old habits whenever they crawled out of the shadows. The midpoint twist reappeared in a different register, as the hospital's new audit team released a preliminary report that corroborated Amina's allegations and reframed Amina's name from a rumor to a symbol of principled resistance, and as the document circulated, a quiet current ran through the corridors. Nurses who had whispered about irregularities now spoke about what real reform requires. And a visit from Amina's cousin, the same plain-spoken man who had confessed to watching the misappropriations with a ledger-like gaze, brought a second surge of clarity. He handed Amina a sealed envelope containing a second set of documents, not about her, but about the hospital's old ledger, and his message was simple: the people who thought wealth could shield wrongdoing would be surprised by how fast transparency travels when the right eyes are watching. He did not claim to be a hero, only a reluctant ally who understood that wealth, if used with humility and accountability, could become a bridge rather than a wall, and his words, paired with Amina's public commitments, stitched the city's attention to a shared duty, to protect the vulnerable, to expose the hidden, and to ensure that mercy had a durable home in policy as well as in prayer. The turning point lands with the matron's formal suspension and the hospital's new governance, an interim administrator appointed, a commission of staff and patients seated on a crescent of chairs, a schedule of audits that will run through the next quarter, while Amina, who had feared destitution, found herself invited to advise on patient rights education, to mentor younger nurses who would carry this work forward, and to participate in a first cohort that would study how a hospital could balance compassion with consequences without losing either. "We are not asking for favors," she told Mercy in a corridor full of muted alarms and the soft clatter of trolleys, "and we are asking for a system that keeps people safe when money and power try to turn Mercy into a ledger line." And Mercy replied with a steady, almost surprised respect, "Then let's build that system together." The scene shifts again when a community gathering outside the mosque square becomes a forum where survivors of hardship tell stories of care that did not come with a price tag, and where a young woman from a market stall, newly admitted to the nursing scholarship, stands with a washed-out apron still hanging from her neck like a flag, and says aloud that her mother's cough once dictated their prayers, but now hope writes its own prayers on the walls of the clinic, and the crowd erupts into a quiet cheer that sounds like a distant drum. As the day's events accumulate, the tangible payoffs begin to outnumber the questions. A donor circle forms around the foundation to fund not only scholarships, but a patient navigators program that helps families maneuver the maze of appointments, waivers, and transport. The first wing's solar array powers a sterilization unit that previously had to wait for diesel cycles, and the old diesel stutter becomes a memory as the city breathes steadier and cleaner air during long afternoons. The hospital's public ledger, once a target for rumor and fear, now sits open for community review, with a town hall-style session scheduled monthly so voices from the street can map needs directly onto the hospital's plans. And at the edge of all this forward motion stands a stubborn thread still waiting for a tighter knot. The whistleblower's identity, never fully disclosed, remains a question mark that every new testimony seems to tilt, but never completely reveal, a reminder that power's glare can be blinding even as mercy's light grows stronger. Still, Amina's eyes return to the small carved fish that sat on the bedside table the day the old man first showed his gratitude, and she finds in that simple symbol a quiet reassurance that a single gesture kept alive long enough to ripple outward through a city that now measures care not by money spent, but by lives saved, by the nurses who learn to speak truth in the same breath they heal, by the children who will grow up knowing the name of a nurse who paid with her own coins and helped turn a hospital into a harbor for the vulnerable. By the closing of this interval, one major thread has closed with visible consequence, and Mrs. Kalu's era of private siphoning has ended. The hospital's governance has shifted toward transparency, and the board's gaze no longer travels only upward but outward, toward the people who depend on them, and the interval's final beat lands on a single hopeful image, the first class of scholarship recipients crisscrossing the courtyard toward a future bright with possibilities, a grandmother smiling at the sight of a nurse who looks at her with respect instead of pity, and Amina, shoulders squared, telling a nurse who asks about the true test of wealth: the test is not whether you can hide your fortune but whether you can share it in a way that makes tomorrow safer for a girl like you. Yet the story leaves one tight thread intact for the next turn, and the whistleblower's face remains unseen, the motive behind the last source's courage remains partly veiled, and as the sun dips behind the solar-winged hospital, Amina looks toward the market where the danfo horns begin to rise again and asks herself what other form of injustice might wait behind the next door. What new proof of mercy will be required to sustain a city's vow to care for its most fragile, and which unseen ally will step forward when the next interval breaks, because the real hinge in this tale is not a single revelation but the ongoing choice to keep mercy honest and power accountable, a choice that begins anew with each patient's quiet breath and every small act that asks us to believe that dignity is a gift we owe to every life, especially the ones who know they have the least voice to claim it.